I just spent the better part of an hour trying to get the engine and transmission straight in the chassis. I'm using the laser to line everything up. Just like when I was building the chassis, I'm centering off of the rear frame rail section and trying to get centered off of the front. However, with this front plate, I can't see the front of the frame, and from welding on the front suspension, we know that that's a little tweaked anyway. But right at our cross member, we should have a good measurement. So I used a plumb bob off of where I could find center, and I'm measuring from the inside of the frame rail to where the plumb bob is hanging to find center. I was only able to figure out where the plumb bob needed to hang based upon where I had originally marked the center line on this mid plate. So I was lining up the mid plate to start, made sure that the back of the frame, the mid plate were good, and then I marked up there, and then I was able to hang that plumb bob. Stuff didn't make sense, so I had to come back and forth quite a bit. And I realized a big part of my problem was I was having like too much stuff moving around, because I was trying to get the front of the block to line up, the mid plate to line up, and the back of the transmission. And just any time I tried to move something, one other thing would wiggle. That's when I decided I gotta get the front of the that's when I decided I needed to get the front of the engine figured out first. And once I made sure that I had crankshaft center line with the plumb bob to both sides, I then drilled and bolted in the plate. This gave me a fixed point around which to be able to pivot a little bit. Once that was settled, I was able to come back and start lining up the mid plate and the transmission, because I knew I had a fixed point back there. So as long as I had the laser lined up in the front, lined up center in the back, I knew wherever it hit along the way needed to be center line of the chassis. And I had to go back and forth because I had been tacked in place with the mid plate a little bit, but I had to cut the tacks and move it. I actually had to shim up this side ever so slightly so I could get everything to sit level this way in the chassis as well. But now we are almost so close you can't see that line on camera for center. And back here, we're centered with that input shaft. I'm glad I didn't rush this, because I would have definitely been off by well over 1/8 of an inch in places. You know, maybe a 1/16 at the best I could have been, but measurements just weren't agreeing. But taking the time and going through it, now everything agrees and I'm confident that it's straight. Now that I have the engine and transmission placed in the car, and I've got a locked in point at the front, I've got the mid plate tack welded on both sides, I know it's going to stay. And the big reason for this now is that I still need to figure out what I'm doing with this transmission crossmember. And I've been back and forth a little bit about it looking here right now. You know, the engine and tranny are nice and they're level in all 3 dimensions. And I kind of want to be able to keep it that way, but the more I was looking at this, I started to notice that the engine is, at the moment, completely behind that front cross member. Once the balancer goes on, that's probably going to be another 2 to 3 inches forward, and I do have enough room to still clear the steering rack up there with that. However, I'm kind of looking at like, well, originally I was going to have this mid plate be like integrated into the car body, but the more I'm looking at it, I should make it removable at the mid plate, and I can make my transmission crossmember removable, and then I could actually drop the entire drivetrain out the bottom of the car by only moving it back about 2 or 3 inches, and it could come out completely assembled. And that sounds really appealing as far as being able to work on this thing. So up here in the front, you can picture, the bouncer is gonna, stick out. It'll clear everything there, no problem. That's the distance I need to go back in order to clear in the front. Possibly a little bit more depending on how the rest of the accessories end up. I know currently I'm kind of planning on the dry sump being cam driven and sticking out up here, but that could be an easily removable part before dropping the entire drivetrain. But I'm looking at it, we'll need to be able to slide back here. So if I just weld this in and integrate this plate completely into the body as part of the chassis, that's not going to work. However, I did add these blocks to the end of this transmission adapter plate where I can put at least 2 bolt holes in. One can go behind this Ford starter relief area and one can go on the bottom. Meanwhile, on the other side, I definitely have room to fit 2 here, no problem. In which case, now I just need to build a mount up off of the frame here, where headers are going to run underneath, but something coming up off the frame that comes out and has a tab to have 2 bolts, preferably from the other side. That way everything can slide back as one, where the mid plate gets unbolted, but the engine and transmission are free to move to the rear. And with the transmission crossmember here, I was already looking at lining it up with the mounts so that I could do through bolts for a nice solid mount there. And then out here on the sides, it'll have to be something that's got an overlap plate and to make the midsection removable. At which point, it basically turns into, I could drop the majority of this crossmember out of the way, and then there's all of the room to the back to be able to pull the engine and transmission fully assembled. Right now, the biggest thing that I'm seeing that's going to hold me back on that is going to be sheet metal. For what I've got for a prefab transmission crossmember kind of a thing, I got 2 sheets. They fit pretty snug up to the bell housing. I was already going to be worried about how much access I had to these upper bolts between the engine and the transmission. However, if I'm just planning on being able to move the entire driveline all in one go, I can certainly build in enough movement for any hoses or anything in the front where the mid plate and the transmission mounts can get pulled and the front mounts on the front plate loosened up, and at least I can tilt it back and have tons of room. The other possibility is I just make sure that I have enough of that move back room built in which case, rather than my firewall being a little bit ahead of the mid plate as I originally planned, I could put it 5-6 inches behind as far as where the trans tunnel section is, and then I'll have to make footwell boxes on each side in order to have room for pedals and stuff. But I mean, honestly, at that point there, we're just talking about sheet metal. I'd rather build more room into being able to work on the car and be less worried about having a ton of room inside the car, because it's not like this thing's going to be doing long road trips. Just cutting out some pieces for the transmission mount, and sucker looks pretty nice and even. I mean, the worst part about it is I free-handed these straight lines. I shouldn't have lined it up like I did with all the other straight lines. But point is I mean, depending on what else you got laying around the shop, I use the 5-gallon bucket to make the radius. You just use other stuff as a guide, that way you can make nice cuts. I'm about to finalize this transmission crossmember. I fabricated this plate. There's some slots for the trans mounts. What I'm going to end up doing here is I have marked where we move back 2 inches. And that mark should work because it puts this transmission bolt near the middle of the slot, but there's still some room up here in front for it to come back a little bit, which I know it's going to, about 1/8 of an inch. So you got plenty of room there. I don't want to slide it back more and end up too tight to the front side of the plate and have a bolt washer hit. So I'm going to stick with the 2 inches that we moved back here at the frame, as far as where those are going to get welted on. Before I weld them on, I'm going to bolt this up to the transmission so that the height is held. These should come out, they gotta come up just a little bit anyway. Everything should work out as soon as it lines up. I didn't quite get the bolt holes drilled super straight, but it was just a matter of getting a couple of them started and then using the ones that were in there and then lining up the other holes. Actually, out of 8 holes, I only had one that was actually significantly off. So the big thing here is now there's some slip room, but it's still a super tight fit on these 3/8 bolts. So as long as all 4 bolts go in, everything's going to be held pretty tight, even though there's some slop in some of them. But that'll be good enough to make sure that we're holding height and side to side. And then the slots are opened up a little bit, so there'll be just a little bit of play as far as transmission alignment. But I want to bolt it up now, weld in the sides, leave all this assembled, and then that's when I'm going to pull the front plate, put the timing cover in so that I get the spacing so that it comes back to the correct place. And then once the front plate is put back on, the transmission cross member here is all bolted up. I can double check the alignment of everything before I start messing around with what I'm going to do for mounts for the mid plate. But I will have to cut those loose, pull the transmission, pull it off. I'm going to trim back that steel panel quite a bit and end up just mounting the aluminum plate is what the plan is. Well, dang it. So I've got the edges here lined up on both sides, but apparently I made my top of the trans mount crooked. So, guessing I'll have to fix that. Probably gonna do something like cut along this back edge and hammer it up a little bit and then re-weld that seam. Now that the trans mount is pulled up tight, I re-welded that. I welded on the frame side as well because now these 2 sections of this cross member need to be locked in place. I can get the bottom later when I flip the frame over. But the bolts are tight now. And well, I got one that's loose here anyway. And that's to be expected because these holes are drilled right at 3/8. They're 3/8 bolts. So really they've only got maybe 5 to 10 thou of clearance at best. So any slight misalignment, they bind up. And really they're not even that tight. It's just a matter of there's some tension on them. So what I'm going to do to fix that is I'm going to wait for everything to cool down. Then it should all be kind of positioned where it needs to be. At which point I can go back and take all of these out and I can oversize the tubes, or I can always just take that 3/8 drill, chase it through it, you know, to keep a really snug, tight fit. How this is set up is this top plate is sitting on top of the tube, and that's on both sides, so it's really kind of controlling my height. So I don't need to have a super tight fit on the bolts in order to control a position. So oversizing them on the tube sections is probably going to be the best move for me. Alright, I've got the excess trimmed off. Boy, it really makes this mid plate seem like a waste at this point, just because I cut everything away, but I mean, it's what I had, and I needed it to get this far to decide what I'm going to do. This mark here is probably what's going to be starter clearance. At least it's what was marked on the mid plate. I don't think it needs to be that big of a cutout, so I'm not going to cut that right now. But it does give me a good idea of how much room I have to put 2 bolts over here, which shouldn't be a problem. I'm going to just put it on this side where I know the starter's at, just match it on this side. That way at least they're the same, that way I can make the brackets the same. And I'll trim this as needed when I get a starter. transmission back in. I added the heads and the headers ahead of time just because I want to know kind of where the exhaust is going to end up at this point. I couldn't quite slip them down in between here. But I had to laser the drive line square again because there is some slop in the slots on the transmission because I wanted there to be. And now when I build the mounts for the mid plate, the front plate and the mid plate will be what holds the drive line square and in line, and then the trans mount can have a little clearance in the holes. That way, you know, getting it up in there, if I gotta get a bolt started just to kind of hold things in place, there's still wiggle room where it doesn't have to be tight and everything can go together. And I don't want to be inducing any undue stress because of the trans cross member mount when the front plate and the mid plate can literally just hold everything and the trans mount's just there to support the back of the trans. I gotta say I'm not super thrilled with the exhaust positioning. You can see this header's got a little bit of in rake to it, and I don't know why I was thinking I could add the pipes all the way over to the side. I guess I was thinking that these headers didn't come back this far. I do have 4.5 inches I can pull out of the secondaries and shorten these things up to give myself more room. I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. I'm kind of disappointed I welded this in already in case I decide to change it later, but I got some parts coming today where I can kind of mock up the exhaust and see what I'm going to do. I was kind of hoping I was going to be able to put the reducer on here in a straight section before I had to worry about moving anything. That was just a lack of forethought on my part. However, I mean, we could easily get a turn made here and get through there. It's just these collectors are 3.5 and I really want it to be 3-inch passing through. But yeah, I'll have to see if I want to do anything different here. Well, after more deliberation with what's going on here, I got a design made for the fronts. So I'm going to get those cut and put in. And then I'm pretty sure I'm scrapping all of this, even though I spent several hours into it now. I'm just going to get rid of it because it's just not going to work for what I want to do. I'll be able to line up stuff a lot easier. I got a new plan there. It's actually going to come above flush, so I'm not so worried about trying to keep the floor flat. I'm just going to have a little bit of riser in the floor. But it's also because I have to do a riser in the front, so I might as well just make the entire floor have a kick up for that section instead of having to figure out different weird things going on. Which means I can basically put a 1 inch or even 1.25 inch tube straight across the top. Just put a flange on it for the trans bolts, and then at the ends I can make some tabs and bolt it in down on the side because the exhaust will be in far enough it won't even matter, and it'll be simpler, a lot lighter, and just sometimes you got to build some things, look at it, and decide that that wasn't the right plan and move on. Transmission crossmember version 2.0. As you can see, it's way smaller and just less in the way altogether. The big reason for the change is now we're kicked up above the top of the frame rail like I am at the front, so the floor is just going to have to kick. The reason I was trying to build the other one was to try to keep the floor completely flat, but that's kind of out now. In order to get this to line up, I have it clamped to the bottom of the transmission mount here. All of that should be level, so I can trust it. I need to support this tube because it's a pretty thin wall tube. It would crush otherwise. So right now I have bolted in there a standoff or a piece of tube that basically goes top to bottom with the bolt passing through it. That's bolted up right now. I have this jacked up so that I can tack weld it from the bottom and pull it off. That way I know the bolts are going in completely square. Then I'll be able to tack the mounts in on the sides, and that'll hold everything in place and be a nice, very light cross member compared to what I had before. And as you can see, we've got tons of room to run the exhaust now. And I'll need to get a couple more bends, but we should be able to turn 45, do the reducer, make our X pipe right there, and then have plenty of room for the mufflers and everything else. So here's my difference between the two cross members. As you can see, it's quite the difference. This weighs almost nothing versus how heavy all this stuff is. I mean, this is lighter than just one of these pieces, and I know the center section's even heavier than those two combined. So, a lot of weight savings here. I also have where this point underneath the hole is kind of useless. I might actually cut this and save a few more ounces, but I mean, overall, I'm way happier with this design. There's just so much more space available underneath it. It's lighter. It's probably going to be more rigid in the end anyway, and be really nice to be able to pull just the two bolts on the sides and drop it completely out of the way in the frame versus still having, you know, only that opening to work around too.